Every morning at sunrise, he'd cast his line from the same weathered pier. 40 years of the same routine, coffee in a thermos, tackle box that had seen better decades, and the kind of patience that only comes from a lifetime of waiting. The Coast Guard crews would wave as they passed on patrol, and he'd nod back with the quiet respect of someone who understood their mission. Nobody ever asked his name, nobody wondered about his story. Just another old fisherman enjoying his retirement, until that morning when the Coast Guard cutter had engine trouble and pulled alongside his pier. The young petty officer helping with repairs glanced at the old man's tackle box and froze, because there, mounted under the lid like it was just another fishing lure, was the Medal of Honor. Welcome to Veteran Stories. Before we dive into this incredible tale of hidden heroism, quiet dignity, and the moment when America's highest honor was discovered in the most unexpected place, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories like this need to be preserved, hit that subscribe button. Some heroes fish in silence, waiting for the right moment to be remembered. Pier 7 at Cape May Harbor stretched 200 feet into the Atlantic, its weathered planks gray from decades of salt spray and Jersey storms. At exactly 6:15 a.m. every morning, as the first light painted the horizon pink and gold, Frank Castellano would begin his walk down the pier. At 78 years old, Frank moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes got people killed. But there was nothing frail about his movements, just the measured pace of someone who'd been walking dangerous ground for most of his life. His equipment was as routine as his schedule: a thermos of black coffee, no sugar, a folding chair that had seen 40 summers, a tackle box older than most of the Coast Guard personnel stationed across the channel, and his fishing rod, a simple spinning setup that he'd owned since 1985, reliable as sunrise. The Coast Guard station Cape May sat directly across the narrow channel, its white buildings and red roofs a constant reminder of the service that had once defined Frank's life. He'd watch their morning exercises with the professional eye of someone who understood the discipline required, the training that saved lives when everything went wrong. Frank had been fishing from Pier 7 every morning for 4 decades. The local fishermen knew him simply as the old guy on 7. The Coast Guard crews who passed on their daily patrols had seen him so often he'd become part of the scenery, reliable as the lighthouse, constant as the tides. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell had been stationed at Cape May for 3 years, and she'd noticed the old fisherman from her first week. There was something different about him, the way he watched their training exercises, the respectful distance he maintained, the subtle way he'd acknowledge their patrols with a slight nod that spoke of understanding rather than mere politeness. "Who's the old guy on the pier?" she'd asked Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez during her second week. "Been there forever," Rodriguez had replied. "Never causes any problems, never gets in the way. Just fishes. Name's Frank something." "Former military?" "Probably. Most of the old-timers around here served somewhere." But Sarah had noticed details that others missed. The way Frank's eyes automatically tracked their patrol patterns. How he positioned himself to have clear sightlines of the harbor entrance. The fact that his fishing gear, while old, was meticulously maintained and organized. "He's not just watching," she'd mentioned to Rodriguez months later. "He's observing. There's a difference." "You think he's a problem?" "No," Sarah had said thoughtfully. "I think he might be an asset we just don't know about yet." Tuesday morning started like any other. Frank arrived at 6:15, set up his gear, and cast his first line at 6:45. The Coast Guard cutter Vigilant was conducting training exercises in outer harbor, running search patterns that Frank recognized from his own distant past. At 8:30, Frank heard the change in the cutter's engine note, the irregular rhythm that meant trouble. He watched as black smoke began trailing from the vessel's exhaust, saw the crew's urgent movements on deck, witnessed the radio calls that would be requesting immediate assistance. The Vigilant limped toward shore, her captain making the decision to dock at the civilian pier rather than risk the longer journey to the Coast Guard station. Frank reeled in his line and moved his gear aside without being asked, understanding that the pier was about to become a workspace. Petty Officer First Class. Tommy Chen was the first to leap onto the pier with mooring lines, followed by Chief Machinist's mate Elena Vasquez and the rest of the crew. Frank stayed out of their way but watched with the interest of someone who understood maritime emergencies. "Sir, you might want to move to a different spot," Tommy called to Frank politely. "We're going to be here a while." "No problem, son," Frank replied. "Take all the time you need." Chief Vasquez got to work immediately, accessing the engine compartment and diagnosing the problem. It was going to be at least 2 hours before they could get back underway, a blown gasket that required careful repair. Tommy found himself with temporary downtime while the chief worked. His eyes wandered to the old fisherman's setup, noting the meticulous organization, the quality of the gear despite its age. "Been fishing here long?" Tommy asked, making conversation. 40 years, give or take," Frank replied, pouring coffee from his thermos. "You boys need anything? Water? Coffee?" "That's kind of you, sir, but we're good." Tommy paused. "That's a nice tackle box. Vintage?" Frank glanced at the battered aluminum case. "Had it since the 80s. Still does the job." Curiosity got the better of Tommy. "Mind if I take a look? I'm kind of a gear enthusiast." Frank hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Sure." Tommy lifted the lid of the tackle box, expecting to see the usual collection of lures, hooks, and sinkers. Instead, he found himself staring at something that made his breath catch in his throat. Mounted carefully under the lid, in a custom-fitted case, was a medal. Not just any medal. The distinctive star-shaped pendant with its light blue ribbon was unmistakable. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. Tommy's training kicked in immediately. He came to attention without thinking about it, his voice carrying across the pier. Chief Vasquez, you need to see this." The urgency in his tone brought the entire crew running. Chief Vasquez wiped grease from her hands and approached the tackle box, expecting to see a safety issue or equipment problem. When she saw the Medal of Honor, she went perfectly still. "Sir," she said quietly to Frank, "is this real?" "Yeah, it's real." Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, without pride or embarrassment. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, who had been monitoring the repair from the cutter's bridge, climbed down to see what had caused the commotion. When she saw the medal, she understood immediately why her instincts about this man had been correct. "Mr. Castellano, Frank Castellano." Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. She'd heard the name before, in military history classes, in stories passed down through the Coast Guard's institutional memory. "Chief Petty Officer Frank Castellano, U.S. Coast Guard, Vietnam War." Frank nodded slowly. "That was a long time ago." Sarah's mind raced through what she remembered. Frank Castellano had been a legend in Coast Guard circles, though few people outside the service knew his story. Vietnam, 1971. A river patrol that had gone catastrophically wrong. "Sir," Sarah said with the respect due to someone wearing the nation's highest honor, "would you mind if I asked—" "The Mekong Delta," Frank said quietly. "March 15th, 1971. We were running interdiction patrols, trying to stop weapons shipments to the Viet Cong." He looked out over the water, his eyes seeing a different river, a different war. "My crew got caught in an ambush. RPGs, automatic weapons, the works. Boat was taking on water, engine was gone, and we had wounded men who weren't going to make it without immediate medical attention." Tommy and the other Coast Guardsmen listened in absolute silence. "I managed to get the boat to a small island in the middle of the river, but we were surrounded. Charlie had us pinned down good. Radio was dead and nobody knew where we were." Frank paused, gathering his thoughts. These weren't memories he shared often, weren't stories he told for entertainment. "Had 4 wounded men, including my co-swain who'd taken shrapnel in the chest. The enemy fire was so heavy we couldn't even raise our heads to return fire. I knew if we stayed there, we were all going to die." Chief Vasquez found herself holding her breath. "So I took our last functioning weapon, an M60 machine gun, and about 500 rounds of ammo. Told my crew to get the wounded ready to move when I gave the signal." "What did you do?" Tommy asked quietly. "I swam to the opposite shore, set up the M60 in a position where I could cover the island, and opened fire on the enemy positions. drew all their attention to me, gave my crew the chance to get the wounded men to better cover and signal for help. Sarah understood immediately what that meant. You held off an entire enemy force by yourself? For about 40 minutes until the cavalry arrived. Helicopter gunships and a rescue boat. Got my boys out, got them medical attention. 3 of the 4 wounded made it home. Chapter 8. The Cost. The simple way Frank told the story didn't diminish its impact. Sarah and her crew understood what they were hearing. A single man had taken on overwhelming odds to save his crew, turning himself into a target to protect his wounded sailors. "How many enemy fighters?" Chief Vasquez asked. Intelligence said about 40, but when you're getting shot at, you don't really count. And you held them off for 40 minutes? Seemed longer at the time? Sarah shook her head in amazement. The Medal of Honor citation. I remember reading about it in training. You were credited with killing or wounding over 20 enemy fighters while wounded yourself. Frank touched his left shoulder unconsciously. Took some rounds, but nothing that stopped me from functioning. The machine gun did most of the work. Tommy was trying to process what he was hearing. This quiet old man who fished every morning had once been a one-man army, had saved lives through actions that defied comprehension. "What happened after the war?" Sarah asked. "Stayed in the Coast Guard for another 20 years, made chief master, ran training programs, taught river warfare tactics, retired in 91. And you've been fishing here ever since?" Frank smiled slightly. "Peaceful work. Good way to watch the water, keep an eye on things." Chief Vasquez had finished her repairs and was ready to report the cutter operational, but she found herself reluctant to leave. Meeting Frank felt like encountering a piece of living history. "Sir," she said, "why keep the medal in your tackle box?" Frank considered the question. "Because it's not mine. It belongs to the 4 men I served with that day, 3 who made it home and 1 who didn't. I just happened to be the one they gave it to." Within hours of the Vigilance return to base, word had spread through the Coast Guard station. Not gossip, but the kind of respectful information sharing that happens when professionals recognize true excellence. By evening, Captain Robert Hayes, the station commander, was standing on Pier 7. Frank was still there, having stayed later than usual, perhaps sensing that his quiet anonymity was about to end. "Mr. Castellano," Captain Hayes said formally, "I wanted to pay my respects." Frank stood up, noting the captain's stars. "Captain, on behalf of the United States Coast Guard, and as a representative of all the men and women who've served since your time in Vietnam, I want to say thank you. What you did, what you've continued to do by setting an example for 40 years, it matters." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Just did my job, Captain." "No, sir, you did everybody's job, at the same time, under impossible circumstances." Frank's peaceful anonymity was over, but the attention was respectful, measured. Coast Guard personnel would stop by to pay their respects, but they understood he valued his solitude. They'd nod, perhaps exchange a few words, but never intrude on his fishing time. Sarah Mitchell made it a point to check on him during her morning runs along the pier. Not official visits, just the courtesy one professional shows another. "Any regrets about people knowing?" she asked one morning. Frank considered the question while watching a Coast Guard training exercise in the distance. 40 years of people thinking I was just some old fisherman who couldn't let go of the past. Now they know I'm an old fisherman who actually lived the past. Makes a difference? To them, maybe. To me, I'm still the same guy who gets up every morning, drinks coffee and casts a line. Word of Frank's presence reached the Coast Guard Training Center, and requests began coming in for him to speak to new recruits. Frank was hesitant at first. He'd never been comfortable with attention, but eventually agreed to share his experience with selected groups. His talks weren't about glory or heroism. They were about preparation, about knowing your equipment, about the split-second decisions that determined who went home and who didn't. "The Medal of Honor isn't about being fearless," he told one group of recruits. "It's about being scared to death and doing your job anyway. Fear keeps you sharp. Overconfidence gets you killed." Tommy Chen, who'd been promoted after the engine incident, attended one of Frank's talks and was struck by the practical nature of his advice. "Sir," Tommy asked afterward, What's the most important thing you learned from that day in Vietnam? That courage isn't something you have, Frank replied. It's something you do. And you do it for the people next to you, not for yourself. 2 years after the discovery of his Medal of Honor, Frank was still fishing from Pier 7 every morning. The routine hadn't changed. Same coffee, same tackle box, same patient approach to the art of fishing. But now his presence served a different purpose. Young Coast Guard personnel would seek him out for advice, guidance, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from having been tested under the worst possible circumstances. Sarah Mitchell, now a full commander, often brought visiting dignitaries to meet Frank, not as a curiosity or a display piece, but as a living reminder of what the Coast Guard stood for at its best. "He's been watching over this harbor for 40 years, she'd tell visitors, making sure we remember that our mission isn't just law enforcement or search and rescue. It's about standing between danger and the people who can't protect themselves." Chief Vasquez, now a senior instructor at the training center, made Frank's story a required part of the curriculum. Not the Medal of Honor citation, that was public record, but the lessons embedded in his actions, the decision-making process that led to extraordinary results under pressure. Castellano's rule, as it became known among Coast Guard personnel, was simple. Your mission is to bring everyone home. Everything else is secondary. Frank wasn't comfortable with having a rule named after him, but he understood its importance. Each new generation of Coast Guardsmen needed to understand that their oath of service meant something beyond paychecks and career advancement. On the 50th anniversary of his Medal of Honor action, the Coast Guard organized a ceremony at Cape May. Frank had tried to decline, but Captain Hayes made it clear that this wasn't optional. The service needed to honor its heroes, especially the ones who'd spent decades hiding in plain sight. The ceremony was small, dignified, attended by Coast Guard personnel past and present. Frank's surviving crew members from Vietnam were flown in, along with family members of the sailor who hadn't made it home. When Frank was asked to speak, he kept his remarks brief. 50 years ago, 4 Coast Guardsmen went into harm's way because that was their job. 3 came home. 1 didn't. Everything that happened after that, the medal, the recognition, the ceremony today, it's all for him. For Seaman Bobby Martinez, who was 19 years old and died fighting for his country in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. The audience was silent as Frank continued. "I've spent 50 years fishing from this pier, watching new generations of Coast Guardsmen learn their craft. Every morning, I see young men and women who volunteered to put themselves between danger and innocent people. That choice, to serve something bigger than yourself, that's the real Medal of Honor." Frank continued fishing from Pier 7 until he was 85, when arthritis finally forced him to trade his daily routine for less frequent visits. Even then, he remained connected to the Coast Guard community, serving as an unofficial advisor to senior leadership on matters of training and tradition. The tackle box with the Medal of Honor was eventually donated to the Coast Guard Museum, but not before Frank had made his point clear. "This belongs to everyone who's ever answered the call. I just happened to be holding it for a while." Tommy Chen, now a chief petty officer, established the Frank Castellano Memorial Scholarship for Coast Guard dependents pursuing careers in maritime service. Sarah Mitchell, who eventually became a rear admiral, often spoke about the old fisherman who taught her more about leadership in casual conversations than she'd learned in years of formal training. For 40 years, Frank Castellano sat on Pier 7, watching over Cape May Harbor with the quiet vigilance of someone who understood that danger could come from any direction at any time. The Coast Guard personnel who passed by thought they were protecting him, but the truth was more complex. He was protecting them through his presence, through his example, through his willingness to share hard-earned wisdom with anyone smart enough to ask the right questions. Some heroes received their recognition immediately, in ceremonies covered by national media. Others wait decades for their stories to be discovered, for their sacrifices to be understood. And some heroes never seek recognition at all. They simply show up every day, do their job, and set an example for the next generation of warriors who will be called upon to stand between civilization and chaos. Frank Castellano was all three kinds of hero. The Medal of Honor around his neck represented a single moment of extraordinary courage. The tackle box that held it represented 40 years of quiet service. And the pier where he fished every morning represented the truth that some people never really retire from protecting others. They just find new ways to stand watch. Have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone whose quiet presence made you feel safer, whose example taught you what real courage looked like, whose story reminded you that heroes don't always wear uniforms? Tell us about them in the comments. Share their story, speak their name, make sure their service is remembered. Because at Veteran Stories, we believe that the most powerful lessons come from the most unlikely teachers, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones fishing quietly at the end of the pier, keeping watch over the harbor while the rest of us sleep safely in our beds.